Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Criminal Cutthroats and Convicts series. We are looking at Part 3, The Boss, George Freeman and the A-Team in his last 10 years, the 1980s. We left off Part 2 just after an attempt is made on George's life. The 70s had been going so well for George. He had made connections and built an empire, with thanks in part to his friends Mr. Big, Lenny McPherson and Stanley Man Smith at his side. The 80s started the Sydney Gangland War. But for now, the A-Team was still on top, removing any competition by swallowing them up or squashing them out, and if need be, by murder, which was suspected an A-Team hit on Stuart John Reagan, as mentioned previously. George made connections into US organised crime through figures Joe Tester and Danny Stein, which saw George's empire grow stronger. There were a few hiccups along the way with police and phone tapping and royal commissions, but they had a handle on it, or so they thought. George has been named as a crime boss by those who would rid the city of crime and corruption. You know, the good, honest, crime-fighting cops and law enforcers, not taking bribes or trying to better themselves through illegal avenues. These men and women pushed hard for an uncorruptible government. The royal commissions were held and kept being held, but until now, nothing has really bothered George. However, he's been shot only days after Neville Wran, Premier of New South Wales, is confronted with the ugly nature of George's activities, although he probably already knew about them. But Neville Wran says, people like George Freeman will get their just deserts in due course. And then George is shot. Newspaper headlines. George is attacked, shot by a sniper in the neck. And another saying that he gave chase after the attack, but had to return home as he was bleeding out. Home to his Yowie Bay property, which, correction, wasn't sold to him by Paddles Anderson, but to Per Scalia's son, Bruce Scalia. And we'll definitely be looking at Per Scalia very shortly. But George, bleeding out everywhere, manages to get himself inside and gets help. Yes, he survives, but doesn't really feel safe. And this is probably why he entertains the thought of Chris Flannery later on as a bodyguard. There we were, thinking that Mr. Big Lenny McPherson was going overboard with his fortress in Gladesville, but obviously George needed more protection than what he had. This proved that George Freeman had enemies willing to take him out, no longer afraid. Excuse the rumblings, I'm recording this as a thunderstorm is passing. Now it is believed the shot was delivered by Jackie Muller, as George had interfered allegedly with his married daughter Lena, who had been hiding out at George's place while hubby Michael Hurley was behind bars. Well, regardless, Jackie was taken care of just 6 weeks later. No one touches the boss and lives to tell the tale. It had affected George. He could have died.
I went in there and come out there.
Do you think they meant to kill you?
I think they meant to kill me. Well, I'll show you the clothes I shot in. The reporters were writing me up for weeks before headlines how many millions and millions I was winning. When I drove in, they might have thought I had some of those millions and millions.
He was interviewed about the incident and his life. Many people, both curious and repulsed by crime figures, tuned in. and it made for a good news story. Chris Flannery turns up in Sydney and a lot of people die. This was around late 79 to early 80s, depending on which murder they pinned him for. And at some point, Chris Flannery, known now as Rent-A-Kill, was introduced to George Freeman. Now, it's on towards 1981. George finds comfort in Georgina McLaughlin, the daughter of a doctor, a lovely blonde woman half his age, and decides he is ready to settle down again. They are married on the 6th of August 1981 with a big party including all of their friends from upper society to crime figures, and everybody in between. Many would state that they were there for the bride's family, as her father was a well-respected doctor. The wedding was around the same time a controversial horse race, apparently bred by George's now 16-year-old son Grant, who wasn't a strong horse, suddenly wins a race the day before, with many people in the industry smelling a rat, believing that George has fixed this race. There were many punters that won off tips that George gave them. The AJC, Australian Jockey Club, and the STC, the Sydney Turf Club, had investigations put forth, and everyone who won was interviewed. Originally nothing came of it in an initial investigation, and then the owners of the horse were ousted from the group, and George had to call on a lawyer to fight off the claim that he had fixed the race, and the threat that he would be dismissed from all racetracks. But he won, and that was usual for George. George wasn't afraid to stand up for himself, and once took a news crew into Parliament House to question a politician over something that they had said about him. Now, a month before George's wedding to Georgina, a shock came when George's partner, friend and associate from Chicago, Joseph Dan Tester, had been assassinated in a bomb explosion in his car in Miami. This was apparently a mob hit, killing off with Tester the hope George and Lenny had with the mob connections. This, however, didn't stop George, nor did it stop Lenny, and they continued with what they were doing. George's home in Yowie Bay was raided early in the 1980s. George heard the helicopters coming over and wondered what it could be, never thinking that they would be raiding his house from above. And after the raid was over, he was recorded as saying that they would have had to have spent a lot of money doing what they did for the element of surprise. Despite all of this, he is only fined $5,000 for SP bookmaking and a further $500 later on in the decade. So all of it was really for nothing. Another Royal Commission, the Street Royal Commission of 1983, seems to do a bit more damage to George's reputation. This time bringing up that alleged photo where he was at the races at Randwick with Dr. Nick Pautos, as well as with Chief Magistrate Farquhar, questioning him about his relationship to the magistrate. But at this point, still nothing comes of it. At least not for another 4 years, when another Royal Commission, the Stuart Royal Commission, starts up again. With George Freeman's name in the headlines, more interviews are lined up, showing George as a family man. In his home that he shares with Georgina, he now has 2 more children, 2 boys. One pictured him holding his son Adam, or his oldest Grant. George had 3 sons and a daughter with Georgina, and the family looked very happy. Sadly, their happiness would be cut short, but not for a few years yet. Now in 1984, George and 2 others were charged with an assault on Chinese businessman Frank Hing after a witness came forward and dobbed them in. But these witnesses disappeared strangely and the case was dropped. And in 1985, Chris Dale Flannery, or Rentakill, goes missing. Now he was meant to be George Freeman's bodyguard, wasn't he? George states that Flannery was never his bodyguard, but Kathleen, Chris Flannery's wife, states that he was the bodyguard, and she'll tell media and police everything. She believed Chris was involved with George Freeman and their illegal activities, and that Chris was the front man for George Freeman, so if someone wanted to attack him, they'd attack Chris. And indirectly, George was the reason that Chris was dead. Kathleen told police that she believed Chris Flannery was going to George's Yowie Bay home. When he couldn't start his own car, he took a taxi to the airport and he disappeared off the face of the earth. This is the story that has remained. Kathleen believes that police were involved in Chris's death. She was offered $50,000 at the time by a policeman on behalf of George Freeman, she believes, possibly guilt money. Decades later, she's come forward and said it was Roger Rogerson.
Corrupt detective Roger Rogerson offered her $50,000. News Corp reports Kathleen Flannery was offered the cash for the loss of her husband just days after he was killed. Flannery's murder remains unsolved after 34 years. Police at the time never investigated Rogerson in connection with the killing.
And when she refused to take this money, there was a bomb found under her own car and threats made on her life. Keep quiet or you're next kind of threat. We'll go into Chris Flannery in a later episode. He needs his own story too. But it is believed at this stage that his big mouth got him into some serious trouble with his own people. At this time, George is laying low, keeping out of the spotlight and distancing himself from Chris Flannery's murder. He's still making a fair amount of money and move residence again. The Royal Commission, or Royal Stewart Commission, in 1985 mentions George and a caller from Parliament House. Someone who was informing George of which officers were involved in raids at his illegal casinos and giving him the heads up on things. They knew someone. It was believed to have been Frank Charlton, a former police officer, but it couldn't be proven. However, mentioning him was enough to put his name back up there again. And at this stage, there's more crackdown on corrupt cops. In 1984, Police Commissioner John Avery was appointed, and further crackdowns and investigations into police corruption were administered. It didn't eradicate it completely, but it was a start.
All my crimes are association. People know me knowing them. And if you want me to stop talking to people, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk to whoever I like. And I can't see why I can't do that.
As well as in 1986, former Chief Magistrate Murray Farquhar goes to jail for evading the course of justice. He'd name-dropped Neville Wran in something that Neville was unaware of, or stated he was unaware of, and this led to Murray going to jail. George Freeman tries to sell his Yowie Bay home many times throughout the 1980s, but can't get the price that he wants for it, saying to interviewers that he'd love to leave the country, but they won't let him. Many believed that if he could, George Freeman would have run. The last couple of years are somewhat quiet in George Freeman's life, if you could call publishing your own biography quiet, detailing in his book how he ended up in a life of crime, but still arguing that he's no longer a criminal and that really he was only an SP bookmaker. He wasn't a crime boss of sorts.
SP's a very minor thing. You asked me a specific question.
About being a big SP?
Yeah, and I just told you I wasn't.
So, your network wasn't as big as the CIA describes it?
No, it definitely wasn't.
It sounds like an exciting read, one that I'd love to get my hands on. But whether or not it holds the truth of what happened, we'll never know. It will forever be a he said, she said as to whether George Freeman was truly a massive crime boss. But it definitely looks like he was up there. If he wasn't the boss of Sydney, he was pretty close to whoever was, or at least a part of the group that was. He also regularly visits Dr. Nick Paltos, or simply just Nick Paltos, after he was arrested for drug importation and sent to Parkley Prison. Love him or hate him, George Freeman was definitely a celebrity. And you know us Aussies love a story. Back in the day, they wouldn't have been able to get enough of him. Now, life for George Freeman wasn't all fun and games, not at least in his last few years, where his health started to fail, suffering from bad asthma attacks as well as kidney disease, and became addicted to the painkiller pethidine. On 20th of March 1990, he suffered an asthma attack at Sutherland Hospital, and he didn't recover. Sadly, Georgina didn't get a long time to spend with her husband, but she did have quite a few children now, and the oldest two were still in their lives. George Freeman was buried at Waverley Cemetery. There were many at the funeral, including his mate Lenny McPherson, as well as Stan the Man Smith, and some other faces. It was speculated that John Ibrahim was a driver for George Freeman, but it couldn't be proven, and others, including an associate, Frank Webb, stated that this was untrue. But John Ibrahim did have a close relationship, and does have a close relationship still, with the Freeman family. The brothers co-owned the Lady Luck's nightclub in King's Cross, but it hasn't been easy for the Freeman family. Following in George's footsteps, Adam has been jailed. Sadly, Adam gets involved in the manufacturing of drugs, and when in 2010 two of the partners he was with were busted with about 20 kilograms of ecstasy in a van near Tamworth, Adam fled to Hong Kong and later gave himself up in Thailand. He spent 30 days in the infamous Bangkok Hilton or Klong Prem prison. He was extradited to Sydney in 2011 and sentenced to 5 years in jail. In the first few weeks he was attacked with a tuna can and received a 10-centimetre laceration. After doing his time, he was arrested again for damaging a Bondi hotel after being found with prescription and non-prescription drugs.
King's Cross identity Adam Freeman has been charged with drug offences in the CBD. Police arrested the son of late underworld figure George Freeman during an operation targeting suspected drug supply. The 37-year-old has been charged with possession of a prohibited drug and a prescribed restricted substance.
Brother David seems to be a successful business owner. It must have been devastating for the boys at such a young age to lose their dad. Hopefully all works out for them and Adam can turn things around. There isn't much said about the other siblings. Perhaps they've chosen to have life away from the spotlight. But it is interesting, and it would have been interesting still to have been a child growing up in that family. Having all of these associates and other crime figures close by, and shootings and things like that. You can imagine how easy it would be for a crime figure's son to either be reared for such a life of crime or at least to fall into it by association. But I find George Freeman an interesting character, and I hope you enjoyed these 3 parts. There's still one more man in the A-team to come, Stan the Man Smith. So if you're enjoying these episodes, definitely give them a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're putting up Stan the Man Smith's A-team episodes.
I accept I was a baddie up till 16 years ago. I don't think I'm a baddie now. Were all my
How
shops.
big was your SP operation?
I wasn't an SP, I was a punter.
But you admit to being an SP.
I admit being an SP. I'm not an SP bookmaker today.
No, but you admit to having been one in the past.
Of course I do.
Right,
I was
well,
just
how
fine
big
for
was it?
It was just ordinary.